Part 1: The First Wind. The wind in Ash Creek, Montana Territory, had a voice. It wasn't the whisper of tall pines or the rustle of cottonwood leaves. It was a dry, scraping sound. The sound of 1,000 brittle blades of grass telling a long story of thirst. It swept red dust from the single street, powdering the raw lumber of the half-finished railway station and rattling the glass pane of the new telegraph office. The year was 1886, and the world was arriving with the clang of a hammer on a steel spike and the insistent clatter of Morse code. High on the roof of a small, sturdy log cabin a mile out of town, May Hale heard that wind. It tugged at the hem of her worn calico dress and tried to steal the shingle from her hand. Her knuckles were raw against the rough-cut wood, but her movements were steady. A loose shingle was an invitation to the first snow, and the first snow was an invitation to a winter that didn't bargain. Below, in the dusty yard, her son, Toby, a serious 7-year-old with his father's dark hair, was patiently trying to tie a frayed rope around the leg of a scrawny but defiant chicken. He worked with a focused gravity, his small brow furrowed in concentration, a miniature man securing his homestead. May paused, pressing a hand to the small of her back. The sky above was a hard, unforgiving sheet of steel blue, promising cold to come. From her perch, she could see the skeletal line of the new railroad ties marching across the basin, and beside them, the glint of freshly strung barbed wire. The wire was Ezekiel Pike's. It cut across a trail her husband, Daniel, had used to drive their small herd to the creek. Now the trail was gone, and so was Daniel, taken by a fever 2 winters past. All that was left was the 160 acres granted by the Homestead Act, a promise on paper that felt as fragile as a spider's web in this wind. Inside the cabin, visible through the clean-swept doorway, stood the table Daniel had built. It was made of pine, scrubbed to a pale white, its surface empty. The sight of it was a dull, constant ache in May's belly, a hollow space that mirrored the one in the pantry. The last of the salted bacon was gone. The cornmeal was a dusty film at the bottom of the sack. Her credit at the Ash Creek Mercantile was stretched thinner than a threadbare sheet, and the interest payment was due in a week. A few hours later, Rowan Calder rode into Ash Creek on a mare the color of a faded juniper berry. He moved with the quiet economy of a man who has spent more time in a saddle than on his own 2 feet. At 35, his face was a map of sun and wind, with steady gray eyes that took in everything and gave away nothing. He wasn't looking for trouble. He'd had his share of that leading a cattle drive through a freak blizzard near the Platte River 3 years ago, a memory that still brought the phantom chill of ice and the heavy weight of 2 good men lost. Now, all he wanted was a place to anchor, a piece of quiet to weigh against the restlessness in his soul. He swung down in front of the livery, the leather of his saddle groaning a familiar song. He traded his worn-out saddle for a second-hand one, checking the stitching with a practiced thumb. Then he walked toward the Mercantile, his boots sinking into the fine red dust. He passed the telegraph office, the frantic clicking from within a sound as alien to him as a sermon in Latin. He saw the new barbed wire for sale, spools of it stacked like monstrous gray spiderwebs. It was the mark of the New West, a land of lines and laws, so different from the open range he'd known. On the edge of town, he'd noticed the Hale place, had seen a woman on the roof, a small, stubborn figure against the vast, empty sky. He'd seen the new wire cutting off the water trail and had felt a familiar, sour tightening in his gut. It was the way of things now. The big fish ate the small, and they used steel teeth to do it. Inside the Mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. Rowan picked up a box of .44 cartridges and a heavy sack of salt. He was standing by the counter, waiting for the proprietor, Mr. Thompson, to finish tallying a ranch hand's order. When May Hale came in, she carried an empty flour sack, folded neatly. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her chin was high. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice clear and low. "I've come for my flower, the one I put the deposit on." Thompson, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by jelly, avoided her eyes. "Ah, yes. May, it's on the wagon out front. Just came in." A small measure of relief softened the lines around May's eyes. She'd used the last of her egg money for that deposit, a promise against the coming week. She nodded, turned, and walked out onto the porch. Rowan saw her speak to the driver of a large freight wagon parked at a slight angle in the street, one of Pike's wagons. He noted. The driver grunted and hefted a 50-pound sack of flour onto his shoulder. Rowan was about to pay for his goods when a man stepped out of the back office. Gideon Frost. He was Pike's right hand, a former Pinkerton with eyes as cold and flat as river stones. He wasn't a big man, but he moved with a predator's stillness. A faint, knowing smile played on his thin lips as he watched the transaction on the street. As the driver swung the sack down toward May's waiting arms, the wagon suddenly lurched. A brake seemed to slip, and the heavy vehicle slid a few feet sideways in the deep dust. It wasn't a violent movement, but it was enough. The driver, caught off balance, stumbled. The heavy sack of flour missed May's grasp entirely, hitting the edge of the wooden sidewalk with a soft, final thud. It split open, a cloud of white exploding against the red dirt. A silent, wasteful catastrophe. The street went quiet. A few onlookers froze, their faces carefully blank. May stood perfectly still, staring at the white powder bleeding into the dust, her one small victory for the day undone in a puff of smoke. The driver straightened up, rubbing his shoulder. "Apologies, ma'am. Wagon slid." Gideon Frost stepped onto the porch, his smile widening almost imperceptibly. He looked from May's stricken face to the ruined flower. "Just an accident," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A terrible shame, but accidents do happen." Rowan watched from the doorway, his hand resting on his sack of salt. He saw the flicker of malice in Frost's eyes. He saw the way the driver refused to look at May. He saw the tight, controlled tremor in May's hands as she clenched them into fists at her sides. It was no accident. It was a message, delivered as cruelly and publicly as possible. May didn't say a word. She gave Frost one long, searing look of contempt, turned on her heel, and walked back into the store, her back ramrod straight. The dignity in that small act was more powerful than any shout. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I'll need another sack. On my account." Thompson wrung his hands, his gaze darting nervously toward the back office where Frost had returned. "I'm sorry, May. I truly am. But Mr. Pike was just in the accounts. He said from now on, for you, it has to be cash only." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Cash only, it was a death sentence. To be denied credit in a place like Ash Creek, heading into winter, was to be told to pack up or starve. The other customers in the store suddenly found the contents of the pickle barrel fascinating. One woman shuffled her children toward the door. May was now an island, the community's fear of Pike creating a vast, empty ocean around her. Her face, already pale, lost its last trace of color. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving behind a brittle, hollowed-out pride. She looked at the well-stocked shelves, the tins of peaches, the sacks of beans, the slabs of bacon, a fortress of sustenance she could not breach. Rowan stepped forward, placing his salt and cartridges on the counter. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't look at Thompson. He looked at May. For a brief second, his gray eyes met her dark, desperate ones. He saw the shame she was fighting, the terror she was trying to hide for the sake of the small boy waiting for her at home. He saw the fierce, unbroken spirit behind the fear. He paid for his items in coin, the clink of silver on the wooden counter unnaturally loud in the silence. As he picked up his purchases, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in her direction. It wasn't pity. It was acknowledgement, a shared understanding that what had just happened was a profound and deliberate injustice. Then he turned and walked out, leaving May to stand alone in the crushing silence of the store. She followed a few moments later, empty-handed. She walked past the white stain on the street without a glance, her focus on the long, dusty mile back to the cabin, back to Toby, back to the empty, scrubbed pine table that was waiting to be filled. From the porch of the Mercantile, Gideon Frost watched her go, the thin smile still fixed on his face. Rowan, now adjusting the new saddle on Juniper, watched Frost. The first wind of winter was blowing through Ash Creek, and it carried more than just dust and the promise of snow. It carried the scent of a fight, a slow, grinding struggle for something as simple and as vital as a place at the table, and for the first time in a long time, Rowan Calder felt the pull of something other than the open trail ahead. He felt the anchor, not of a place, but of a wrong that needed righting. Part 2, Ride With Me. I'll fill your table tonight. May stood on the splintered planks of the Mercantile porch, the world having shrunk to the space she occupied. The cold wind was a physical thing, pushing against her, trying to find the cracks in her resolve. Around her, the silence of the other townsfolk was louder than any jeer. They were witnesses to her humiliation, their averted eyes a verdict of her failure. She saw Mrs. Gable hurry her daughters away, heard the low murmur between two ranch hands who had stopped to watch the show. Each quiet judgment was another stone laid on her shoulders. All she could think of was Toby's face, his unquestioning trust that she would provide. And she had failed. The dust swirled around a pair of scuffed leather boots that stopped at the bottom of the 3 short steps leading down from the porch. She didn't look up, not wanting to see another face filled with pity or scorn. She just wanted to be invisible, to dissolve into the red dust and be carried away by the wind. A voice, low and steady, cut through the noise in her head. It was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Ride with me. I'll fill your table tonight." Her head snapped up. It was the stranger from the store, the cowboy with the quiet eyes. He was standing just below her, his gaze direct, holding no trace of the pity she dreaded. He wasn't looking down on her. He was looking at her. His posture was slightly stooped, a gesture of respect that closed the space between them without being threatening. In his hands, he held the sack of salt and his box of ammunition. For a moment, May was speechless. The offer was so direct, so impossible. Pride, sharp and painful, flared in her chest. It was all she had left. "I don't take handouts." "Mr.," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. It was important that the others didn't hear, that this transaction, this refusal of charity, remained hers alone. The man didn't flinch. His gray eyes held hers. "It's not a handout. Call it a neighborly loan. You can pay me back when you're able. A few pies, maybe. Mending a shirt. The trail is hard on clothes." He wasn't smiling, but the suggestion was gentle, offering her a way to keep her dignity intact. She wanted to say no again. The word was on the tip of her tongue, but then the image of the empty table flooded her mind. She thought of Toby's small, hollowed stomach, the way he'd tried not to complain when their supper the night before had been just a thin broth made from the last of the garden onions. Her pride was a luxury, a fire that warmed only herself. It couldn't fill her son's belly. The fight between her self-respect and her son's needs was a brutal, silent war waged in the space of a single heartbeat. Her gaze flickered past the cowboy's shoulder, across the street to the small cafe run by Ada Quinn. Ada, a widow herself for 10 years, was standing in her doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She had seen the whole ugly affair with the flower, her expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. Now, she was watching them, as May's eyes met hers. Ada gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was a seal of approval from someone who understood the town's currents, a signal that this man's offer was likely what it appeared to be an act of simple kindness in a hard world. The tension went out of May's shoulders. She gave the cowboy a single, jerky nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He didn't press. He simply said, "My horse is over here. Juniper." He led the way to the mare, who snorted a soft plume of white into the cold air. With a natural ease, he tied his own supplies behind the saddle and then turned to her. "Your boy's at the homestead?" "Yes, Toby." "All right then." He cupped his hands. "Up you go." She hesitated for only a second before placing her worn boot into his steady hands and letting him lift her onto the saddle. She sat astride, an improper way for a lady to ride, but there was no side saddle and no time for propriety. Rowan swung up behind her, his presence a solid warmth at her back. He smelled of leather, dust, and the cold. Clean air. It was a scent of the wild, of self-sufficiency, and it was strangely comforting. As they rode out of Ash Creek, she was acutely aware of the eyes on her back. The whispers would start now, flies buzzing over a fresh wound. That Hale widow, taking up with a drifter. No sooner is her husband in the ground. She straightened her back, focusing on the rhythm of the horse's gait, on the steady presence of the man behind her. Let them talk. Tonight, Toby would eat. When they arrived at the cabin, Toby was in the yard, whittling a piece of wood with a small, dull knife. He looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of his mother on a strange horse with a strange man. He immediately stood, putting himself between them and the cabin door, a small, fierce protector. Rowan dismounted smoothly and slid to the ground. He didn't approach the boy directly. He went to Juniper's head and began loosening the cinch, speaking to the horse in a low murmur. "Toby," May said, her voice tight as she slid down. "This is Mr. Calder. He's helping us." Toby's gaze remained fixed on Rowan, suspicious. Rowan finally turned, giving the boy a slow nod. "Toby, that's a fine-looking chicken you've got there." The boy's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Her name is Henrietta." "A good, strong name." Rowan untied a rifle from his saddle. "I'm going to walk down to the creek. I'll be back directly." He gave May a brief look, then turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the distance to the line of willows that marked the water. May watched him go, a swirl of conflicting emotions inside her. She led Toby into the cabin. The empty table seemed to accuse her. "Light the fire, sweet boy," she said, her voice softer now. "We're going to have a hot supper tonight." Toby's eyes lit up, the suspicion replaced by a pure, uncomplicated hope that made her heart ache. Less than an hour later, Rowan returned. In one hand, he carried 2 rabbits, limp and dark against the pale grass. He didn't make a show of it. He walked to the woodpile, skinned and cleaned them with a few swift, efficient movements of a knife from his belt, and brought the meat to the cabin door. "I'll need a pot, if you have one," he said, his voice practical. Inside, he worked with the same quiet competence. He found the last of her onions and a few wrinkled carrots in the root cellar bin. He chopped them with her worn kitchen knife, his large hands surprisingly deft. Soon, a stew was simmering over the fire, the simple, savory smell slowly pushing back the cabin's persistent chill. May found herself moving around him, fetching a wooden spoon, adding a pinch of salt from his own newly bought sack. They worked in a strange, unspoken rhythm. 2 strangers building a meal together in the dimming light. She watched his hands, strong and calloused, but gentle as he stirred the pot. She watched his face, silhouetted by the firelight, his expression calm and focused. He wasn't a talkative man. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of the pot. This was what she feared, this feeling of being cared for. It was a dangerous comfort. Daniel had been the provider, the protector. When he died, She had built a wall of fierce independence around herself and Toby. To let someone else inside that wall, even for a night, felt like a betrayal of her husband's memory and a surrender of her own hard-won strength. For his part, Rowan felt the four walls of the cabin closing in. For years, his home had been the open sky. His anchor had been the horizon. To be here, with the scent of a woman's home around him, a faint scent of soap and wood smoke, and a child watching him with wide, curious eyes. It stirred something he'd long thought buried. It reminded him of warmth, of roots, of things that could be lost. He thought of the blizzard, of the faces of the men who had trusted him, tying himself to this woman and her boy. Even in this small way, felt like tempting fate to strike again. It was easier to keep moving. It was safer. When the stew was ready, May ladled it into 3 bowls. They sat at the pine table, the one Daniel had built. The flickering oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow on the wood, illuminating the steam rising from their food. Toby ate with a quiet, desperate intensity, his eyes closing in bliss at the taste of the rich broth and tender meat. The meal was eaten in near silence, but it was a comfortable silence, filled not with emptiness, but with the profound satisfaction of a shared meal. The table was no longer a symbol of lack. It was a raft of warmth and sustenance in a cold, hostile world. For the first time in a long time, May felt a flicker of hope. After they finished, Rowan stood. The evening had settled, and the wind howled a lonely song around the cabin's corners. "I should go. It's getting dark." He couldn't stay. They both knew it. For him to spend the night under her roof would be to give the gossips a feast. May walked him to the door. "Thank you, Mr. Calder," she said, her voice sincere. I don't know how to repay you." "Rowan," he corrected her gently. "And we already have a deal. I'll be back for that mending." He looked past her, at the roof she'd been working on. "And I'll bring some proper nails for those shingles. The ones you're using will split the wood before the first big snow." It was a simple, practical statement, but it was also a promise. "I will be back." It hung in the air between them. A thread of connection spun in the cold night air. He mounted Juniper, the mare a dark shape against the starry sky. He looked down at May, a small, solitary figure framed in the warm light of her doorway. "Good night, May." "Good night, Rowan." She watched until he and the horse were swallowed by the darkness. Then she closed the door. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a full belly, of a secured roof, of a small, unexpected kindness. She looked at the table, now cleared but for the warm glow of the lamp. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the lingering scent of rabbit stew and the faint, fragile promise of a new day. Part 3, barbed wire and fine print. True to his word, Rowan returned 2 days later. He didn't ride up to the cabin with a grand announcement, but appeared at the edge of the property near dawn, leading Juniper, who had 2 fresh-cut lengths of pine tied to her saddle. He carried a small, heavy sack that clinked with the sound of new nails. He worked for the better part of the morning on the roof, his hammer taps a steady, reassuring rhythm against the silence of the prairie. May brought him a tin cup of water, and they stood on the sturdy new shingles, a comfortable distance between them, and looked out over the land. The brittle grass shimmered gold under the autumn sun, beautiful and deceptive. It was a beauty that promised a bitter winter. The days fell into a pattern. Rowan never stayed the night, always disappearing back to the small camp he'd made in a cottonwood grove by the creek. But his presence became a part of the homestead's life. He didn't offer charity. He offered work. He traded his labor for meals. He restrung the sagging wire on May's small pasture fence, his hands twisting the metal with a practiced efficiency. He took Daniel's dull axe and spent an afternoon turning a fallen cottonwood into a formidable woodpile that stood as a bulwark against the coming cold. It was during these quiet hours of work that Toby, after days of solemn observation, began to gravitate toward him. One afternoon, as Rowan was splicing a broken rope for the well bucket, Toby approached, a smaller piece of frayed twine in his hand. "Can you show me a knot?" the boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Rowan stopped his work. He looked at the boy, whose dark eyes were wide with a seriousness that mirrored his mother's. Rowan felt a familiar caution, a warning in his gut about letting this small person claim any piece of him. But the boy's earnest gaze was impossible to refuse. "All right," Rowan said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Give me that twine. I'll show you a bowline. It's a good knot, a loop that won't slip, no matter the strain you put on it." He took the twine, and his large, calloused fingers moved with surprising delicacy, looping and tucking the cord. Toby leaned in close, his head almost touching Rowan's arm, his focus absolute. As Rowan tightened the finished knot and handed it back, he saw a flicker of pride in the boy's face. It was the pride of learning something real, something useful. From then on, knot tying became their ritual, a quiet language of trust built loop by loop. May would watch them from the cabin doorway, her heart a tangle of gratitude and apprehension. The sight of her son looking up at another man with such open admiration was a bittersweet ache. She was learning to accept help without feeling diminished by it, but she knew this fragile peace they were building was on borrowed time. A week later, May rode into town on the old mule Daniel had left her. A mended shirt for Ada Quinn folded in her saddlebag. Ada's cafe was an oasis of warmth and the rich smell of chicory coffee. After handing over the shirt, Ada pressed a small bag of coffee beans into May's hands and steered her toward the back room, away from the prying ears of the other customers. "May, I need a word with you," Ada said, her usually cheerful face grim. "It's about your contract with the mercantile, the one Daniel signed for the seed and supplies 2 years ago." May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What about it?" "I've seen Pike do this before. To the Millers and Old Man Hemlock," Ada said, her voice low. "He uses contracts written by a fancy lawyer back east. They're full of tricky words. Have you read every line?" Daniel read it. He said it was standard. "There's a clause in there," Ada insisted, "about ancillary costs and market adjustments. It gives the lender Pike the right to add fees for transport, storage, anything he deems necessary, and to adjust the interest based on prices set by the railroad freight office. Prices he controls." The vague words felt like a tightening noose, but that can't be legal. "It's just legal enough to be a weapon," Ada said, her eyes dark with worry. "He's not just selling goods. May, he's selling debt, and he's using it to collect land." The coffee bean suddenly felt heavy in May's hand. Ada's warning gave a name to the formless dread she'd been carrying. Armed with this new fear, she went to see Deputy Luis Ortega. His office was a small, clean room next to the telegraph station, smelling of ink and stale tobacco. Ortega was a good man, with kind eyes and a weary mustache, but he was one man in a territory where power was measured in cattle and acreage, not badges. He listened patiently, then took the copy of the contract she'd brought and spread it out on his desk. He read it slowly, his finger tracing the lines of dense, spidery script. Finally, he leaned back with a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole town's troubles. "Ada's right to be suspicious. May," he said, his voice full of regret. "The language is slippery. On the face of it, it's all above board. To prove in front of a judge that Pike is deliberately inflating those market adjustments, you'd need access to his private ledgers, his shipping manifests from the rail station." He gestured toward the wall he shared with the telegraph office. "You'd need a mountain of paper to fight a mountain of money. It's hard to overturn a thing that's built to look solid." He handed the contract back to her. The paper felt like a verdict. She left the office with the deputy's sympathetic but helpless gaze following her out the door. The law, it seemed, was just another fence with gaps only men like Pike knew how to squeeze through. The confrontation she'd been dreading came 2 days later. A fine carriage, far too elegant for Ash Creek's dusty street, rolled up to her homestead. Ezekiel Pike himself stepped out, dressed in a tailored wool suit that seemed to repel the dust around him. Gideon Frost was with him, as always, though he remained mounted on his black horse, a silent, menacing statue, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. Pike strode onto her porch as if he already owned it. "Mrs. Hale," he began, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that oozed false concern. "I've been worried about you. A woman alone, a boy to feed, with winter on its way. It's a heavy burden." May stood in her doorway, Toby half hidden behind her skirts. Rowan was at the woodpile. The rhythmic thud of his axe suddenly silenced. He didn't move closer, but his presence was a solid, watchful weight at the edge of the yard. "We're managing, Mr. Pike," May said, her voice even. "Are you?" Pike's eyes swept over the tidy yard, the solid roof, the stack of firewood. He seemed displeased by the signs of stability. "Look, I consider myself a pillar of this community. It pains me to see folks struggle. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. I'll buy this homestead from you, take the land, clear your debt at the mercantile, and leave you with enough cash for 2 train tickets to wherever you please. California, perhaps. A warmer climate." "This is my home," May said, the words tasting of iron and earth. "My husband is buried here. It's not for sale." Pike's smile tightened. The mask of benevolence slipped. "Homesteading is a dream for men, Mrs. Hale, not a burden for widows. My offer is more than fair. It is, in fact, final. I suggest you consider it carefully before the first snow flies." He turned without another word and climbed back into his carriage. As it rolled away, Frost did not immediately follow. He nudged his horse into a slow, deliberate walk along the perimeter of May's property, his cold gaze fixed on the cabin. He was a wolf circling a sheep pen, making his presence known, reminding her of her vulnerability. From the woodpile, Rowan didn't move. He simply stood, the axe held loosely in one hand, and watched Frost. His stillness was an answer to the threat, a silent declaration that this pen was not unguarded. The 2 men stared at each other across the 100 yards of brittle grass, the air crackling with unspoken violence. After a long moment, Frost gave a slight, derisive smirk, turned his horse, and trotted off after Pike's carriage. That evening, the mood in the cabin was somber. The stew Rowan made from a brace of grouse tasted like ash in May's mouth. She sat at the table, the contract spread before her, the lamplight shining on the confusing paragraphs. The fine print felt like a tangle of barbed wire, designed to snag and tear and hold her fast. Through the window, she could see the silhouette of Rowan. He was walking the fence line he'd repaired, checking the tension of the wire, his tall frame a dark shape against the deepening twilight. He was shoring up their defenses, but May knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their real fight wouldn't be won with fences or firewood, but with the mysterious, locked-away numbers in a ledger she could never hope to see. The small acts of survival were adding up, but so was the pressure from the world outside, building and building like the clouds massing on the horizon, promising a storm. Part 4, White Squall. The storm did not arrive with a warning. It simply swallowed the day. 1 hour. The sky was the familiar hard, steel blue of late autumn. The next, it was a bruised, churning gray that pressed down on the prairie, stealing the light and the air. The wind, which had been a constant, dry whisper for weeks, began to howl, a rising, mournful cry that clawed at the chinking in the cabin walls. Then came the snow. It wasn't the gentle, drifting flakes of a picturesque winter, but a hard, blinding curtain of white, driven almost horizontally by the wind. Inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to the warm circle of light cast by the oil lamp. Rowan had brought in a large stack of wood before the first flakes fell, his movements quick and purposeful, his gaze fixed on the ominous horizon. Now, The fire in the hearth roared, fighting a losing battle against the drafts that snaked across the floor. May was trying to patch one of Toby's shirts, but her hands were unsteady. Every shriek of the wind sounded like a hungry animal trying to get in. Toby, who had been unusually quiet all afternoon, was huddled in a blanket near the fire. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to catch in his small chest. When May went to him, her hand instinctively going to his forehead, the heat she felt was a jolt of pure terror. It was a dry, searing heat. His cheeks were flushed a feverish red, but he shivered uncontrollably. "My head hurts, Mama," he whimpered, his eyes glassy and unfocused. May's blood ran cold. It had come on so fast, a simple chill, now a raging fever. In town, Doc Merriweather had quinine for fevers like this, herbs to soothe a cough, but town might as well have been on the moon. The telegraph line would be down, the road impassable. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. She dipped a cloth in cool water and laid it on his forehead, a uselessly small gesture against the fire consuming him from within. Rowan watched from the other side of the hearth, his face grim. He saw the panic rising in May's eyes, the way her hands trembled as she tried to soothe her son. He saw the stark reality of their situation, a sick child, a worsening storm, and no help. The memory of the blizzard on the Platte River rose in him, cold and suffocating, the shouts lost in the wind, the sight of a good man frozen in his saddle. He had made a mistake then, pushed the herd too hard, listened to the wrong man. He had sworn he would never again be responsible for lives caught in the teeth of a storm. But this was different. This wasn't a herd. It was a boy burning with fever and a woman trying to hold her world together with her bare hands. To do nothing was its own kind of failure. He stood up, his decision made in an instant. "I'm going to town," he said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. May looked up at him, her face a mask of disbelief and fear. "You can't. It's a white wall out there. You'll be lost in 5 minutes." "Juniper knows the way, and I know the feel of the land," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He was already pulling on his heavy sheepskin coat. "The boy needs medicine. May, there's no other choice." He went to the small chest where he kept his things and pulled out a coil of rope and a lantern. The sight of the lantern, a small, fragile source of light, was both a comfort and a stark reminder of the darkness it would have to fight. May followed him to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's too dangerous. Rowan, please!" He turned to her, his gray eyes steady. "Staying here is more dangerous." He looked over at Toby, who had lapsed into a fitful, moaning sleep. That sight solidified his resolve. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling chaos of the storm. May shot the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound echoing the finality of his departure. She was alone again, but this time, the loneliness was sharpened by a new and terrifying fear for the man who had just walked out into the blizzard for her and her son. The wind hit Rowan like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving ice crystals into his skin. The snow was so thick he couldn't see the wood pile 10 feet from the cabin. It was a world without landmarks, a disorienting vortex of white. He found Juniper huddled in the lean-to, her coat already thick with snow. She nickered softly, her warm breath misting in the frigid air. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his hands moving surely as he saddled her. "We've seen worse than this." It was a lie, but one he needed to believe. Once mounted, he gave Juniper her head, trusting her instincts more than his own eyes. They moved at a slow, plodding walk, each step a gamble. The snow was already drifting, hiding dips and rocks. The world was a maelstrom of sound and fury. And Rowan bent low over the saddle, the lantern he'd lit swinging from his hand, its feeble yellow light creating a small, shifting bubble in the suffocating whiteness. He had been riding for what felt like an eternity when another shape materialized out of the storm, a rider on a dark horse, blocking the faint trace of the path ahead. For a heart-stopping moment, Rowan thought it was a phantom, but this was real. It was Gideon Frost. Frost sat on his horse as if he were part of the storm itself, a black coat covering him from neck to heel, snow clinging to the brim of his hat. He didn't seem to feel the cold. "Lost, Cowboy?" Frost's voice was flat, carrying easily over the wind. "Get out of my way, Frost," Rowan said, his hand moving instinctively closer to the worn handle of the pistol at his hip. Frost's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. "Pike doesn't like loose ends, and you're starting to look like one. That homesteader and her brat aren't your concern. This is your one chance to ride on and forget you ever saw Ash Creek." "The boy is sick. I'm going for the doctor." "A shame," Frost said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Things die out here. It's the way of the world. But you don't have to." He urged his horse closer, until they were almost knee to knee. "This isn't your fight. Turn around, or you'll be buried in it." Rowan stared into Frost's dead eyes. There was no bargaining with a man like this. He pulled Juniper's reins, steering her around the other horse. "I'm going through." For a moment, he thought Frost would let him pass, but as he drew level, Frost's horse suddenly sidled, bumping hard against Juniper. They were approaching the narrow wooden bridge over Ash Creek, its planks already slick with a treacherous layer of ice and snow. Just as Rowan was trying to control his startled mare on the slick footing, Frost leaned over and gave him a powerful, deliberate shove. It was brutally efficient, thrown off balance on the icy surface. Rowan had no chance. He was knocked clean out of the saddle. He hit the low wooden railing with a sickening crack of bone and muscle, and then tumbled over the side, landing in the snow-covered rocks on the creek bank below. The lantern shattered, its light extinguished. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was the sound of Frost's horse galloping away, swallowed once more by the storm. He came to with a gasp, the frigid water of the creek seeping into his clothes. His head was throbbing, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his left shoulder. He tried to push himself up, but the world spun violently. Above him, the storm raged on, utterly indifferent. He was going to die here, he realized with a strange, cold clarity. He was going to freeze to death a mile from town, having failed again. Just as his vision began to fade to black, another light cut through the snow. A voice called his name. "Calder, Calder, is that you?" It was Deputy Ortega, holding a lantern high. He had been worried about the Hales, had decided to ride out and check on them despite the storm. He'd found Juniper, riderless and agitated, standing at the far end of the bridge. Ortega scrambled down the bank, his face a mixture of shock and concern. "My God, man, what happened? Did you fall?" "Frost!" Rowan gritted out, the name a shard of ice in his throat. "He pushed me." Ortega's jaw tightened. He helped Rowan to his feet, supporting him as they struggled back up to the road. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth," Rowan said, leaning heavily on the deputy. Ortega didn't question him further. He helped Rowan onto his own horse and led them the rest of the way into town, Juniper trailing behind. They went straight to Doc Merriweather's small surgery. The doctor, a man with kind, tired eyes, clucked his tongue as he examined Rowan. "A dislocated shoulder, a nasty gash on your head, and you'll have more bruises than a bushel of old apples," the doc declared. "But nothing that won't mend. You're a lucky man, son." While the doctor set Rowan's shoulder with a gut-wrenching pop and stitched the cut on his scalp, Ortega stood by the pot-bellied stove, his expression troubled. After the doctor had given Rowan a small bottle of quinine and another of laudanum for the pain, he left them alone. "Frost will say you slipped," Ortega said quietly, handing Rowan a cup of hot, black coffee. "His word against yours." Rowan just nodded, his mind a haze of pain and cold fury. Ortega looked at him, really looked at him, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. You know, seeing him tonight, it jogged a memory. That name, Gideon Frost, he wasn't always Pike's man. He was a Pinkerton investigator a few years back, came through Dodge Flats to investigate that big fire at the railway warehouse. The coffee cup stopped halfway to Rowan's lips. The room seemed to tilt. Dodge Flats, the fire, the two men who had died. The official report had called it an accident, sparked by a stray ember. But Rowan knew better. He had been the trail boss, blamed for camping the herd too close. He had taken the blame to protect the owner's son, a reckless fool who had been smoking in the hayloft, and the investigator who had closed the case, who had sealed Rowan's guilt and set him adrift. Was Gideon Frost. The past wasn't buried. It had followed him here. He pushed the painful revelation aside. "I have to get back," he said, his voice raw. "The boy." Ortega tried to protest, but he saw the unshakable resolve in Rowan's eyes. He helped him back into his still damp coat and walked him out to where Juniper waited, her reins in the deputy's hand. "Be careful, Rowan," Ortega said, his voice heavy with meaning. "This is about more than just a piece of land now." The ride back was a blur of pain and sheer willpower. The storm had lessened its fury slightly, the wind no longer a constant shriek. As he cleared the last rise, he saw at a single point of yellow light in the vast, churning darkness. The lantern May had left in the window. It was a beacon, a promise of warmth and safety. It was a lighthouse calling him home. When he stumbled through the cabin door, he almost fell. May caught him, her small frame surprisingly strong. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror and relief. "Rowan, oh, thank God." She helped him to a chair by the fire, her hands fluttering over him, taking in his pale face, the bandage on his head, the way he held his arm. She didn't ask what happened. Not yet. She took the medicine from his numb fingers and went to Toby, carefully measuring out a dose. Then she came back to him. The storm still raged outside, but in the small cabin, a profound quiet had fallen. She knelt before him and took a clean cloth, dipping it in the warm water from the kettle. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firm and gentle as she cleaned the grime and dried blood from his face. Her fingers brushed against his cold skin, and he saw the unshed tears glistening in her eyes. Finally, her hand came to rest on his forehead, her palm warm against his icy skin. It wasn't a gesture of nursing. It was a touch of profound, unspoken gratitude, of a connection forged in fear and desperation. In that single, quiet moment, with the storm howling outside and a child breathing easier in his sleep nearby, the walls Rowan had built around his heart for 3 long years began to crumble. Part 5, The Old Flame. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind's howl gentled to a weary sigh, and a pale, watery light filtered through the cabin's single window, revealing a world transformed, buried under a pristine blanket of white. The silence was profound. Inside, the only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the steady, even breathing of Toby, asleep in his cot. The fever had broken in the night, his skin now cool and damp to the touch. Rowan had not left. He couldn't have, even if he'd wanted to. May had insisted he stay, setting up a makeshift bed for him on the floor near the hearth, close to the warmth. His shoulder was a deep, grinding ache, and his head throbbed in time with his pulse. But the pain was a dull counterpoint to the quiet sense of peace that had settled in the small room. May moved about the cabin in the gray morning light, her steps soft so as not to wake her son. She stoked the fire, put a pot of coffee on to boil, and brought a cup to Rowan. She knelt beside him, her face etched with a concern that went deeper than simple gratitude. "How did it happen, Rowan?" she asked, her voice low. "The bridge, your shoulder. It wasn't just a fall, was it?" He took the coffee, his good hand wrapping around the warm tin. He looked from her worried face to the sleeping boy. Then into the flames. The truth was a heavy stone he had carried for 3 years, and Ortega's words had dislodged it, making it impossible to hold any longer. Frost was there, he said simply, his gaze remaining on the fire. He was waiting for me. He told me to ride on, to leave you and the boy to your fate. He took a slow sip of coffee. I didn't listen. May's breath hitched. He pushed you. It wasn't a question. He did, Rowan confirmed. But it's more than that. May, this isn't the first time my path has crossed with Gideon Frost's. He told her then, the story spilling out in the quiet cabin, his voice flat and devoid of self-pity. He spoke of Dodge Flats, of the big cattle drive for a wealthy rancher, of the owner's reckless son who'd been given too much responsibility. He told her how the son, against Rowan's direct orders, had insisted on bedding the herd down in a dry pasture right next to the railway warehouse, wanting to be close to the town's saloons. He described the smell of smoke, the orange glow against the night sky, the terrible, panicked bellowing of the cattle. It was the boy, Rowan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He'd been smoking in the hayloft. Dropped a cigarillo. By the time we knew, the whole place was an inferno. He paused, the memory playing behind his eyes. 2 men were trapped inside. Good men. They never made it out. The owner paid me a lot of money to take the blame. He said his son was young, that it would ruin him. He said the official report would call it an accident, a stray spark from a passing train, but that the company would need someone to hold responsible. He called it a clean slate for me, a fresh start somewhere new. Rowan's mouth twisted into a bitter line. The Pinkerton investigator who came to close the case, the one who took the owner's statement and made sure my name was the only one on the final report. That was Frost. He knew it was a lie. I could see it in his eyes. But he took the money and buried the truth. He fell silent. He had never told another living soul the full story. To say it out loud, to give the shame and guilt a voice, was both a release and a reopening of the wound. May listened without interruption, her dark eyes never leaving his face. She saw not a drifter running from his past, but a man of principle who had been betrayed. She saw the weight he carried, the ghosts of 2 dead men and a lie that had cost him his name. When he was finished, she didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his good arm, her touch a silent testament of belief. It was enough. They spent the day snowbound, prisoners in their small, warm fortress. The world outside was gone, and in its absence, a new world was created within the cabin's 4 walls, a world of quiet understanding, of shared tasks and easy silence. Toby woke near midday, weak but clear-eyed, and ate a small bowl of broth Rowan prepared. As evening fell again, a deep chill settled into the cabin. They huddled by the fire, sharing a thick wool blanket. The space between them, once measured in careful feet, had shrunk to nothing. They sat shoulder to shoulder, listening to the drip of melting snow from the eaves and the pop and hiss of the logs in the hearth. In the flickering firelight, Rowan looked at her. He saw the strength that had kept her fighting alone for so long, and the vulnerability she so carefully hid. He saw the faint smudge of soot on her cheek and the way the light caught the dark strands of her hair. He had come to Ash Creek looking for a place to anchor, and he was beginning to realize it wasn't a piece of land he'd been searching for. May felt his gaze on her. She looked up, and in the depths of his steady gray eyes, she saw not the hardness of a trail-worn cowboy, but a profound loneliness that mirrored her own. She saw the man who had ridden into a blizzard for her son, who had faced down frost, who had trusted her with the truth of his past. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, he leaned in. His movement was hesitant, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She met him halfway, her eyes fluttering closed as his lips gently met hers. The kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of quiet discovery. It was as warm and as necessary as the fire that burned beside them, a soft, tender acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in the heart of the storm. It was a promise of comfort, a moment of solace in a world that had offered them so little. They drew apart slowly, the unspoken question hanging in the warm air between them, and in the soft glow of the fire, found their answer in each other's eyes. The next morning, the world reasserted itself. The sun was brilliant on the fresh snow, and the trail to town was passable. Though treacherous, Rowan knew he couldn't stay. He had a camp to check on, and more importantly, they both knew what his presence at the cabin in the full light of day would mean. As he saddled Juniper, the air was crisp and clean, but carried a new tension. By the time May reached Ash Creek later that day for supplies, the whispers had already begun. Mrs. Gable, the woman who had hurried her children away from the mercantile, saw her coming out of Ada's cafe and stopped dead, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. "Well, May Hale," she said, her voice loud enough for the two other women with her to hear, "I see the storm provided you with company. A widow must be so careful of her reputation, especially with a young boy to think of." May's face flushed with anger and shame. Before she could form a reply, Ada Quinn stepped out of the cafe, a rolling pin lightly coated in flour in her hand. "Be careful of your tongue, Eleanor," Ada said, her voice dangerously sweet. "That company is the man who rode through the blizzard to get medicine for May's sick boy while the rest of this town was hiding by their fires. If that's a sin, I'd say we could all use a little less righteousness." "Mrs. Gable sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red, and hurried away with her friends, muttering about falling standards. "Don't you pay them any mind," Ada said, turning to May. "Their piety is just a cloak for their envy." May was grateful for Ada's defense, but the encounter left a sour taste in her mouth. She was learning that kindness came with a cost, and that survival wasn't just a battle against Pike, but against the petty, cruel judgments of her neighbors. The legal threat, however, was far from petty. Deputy Ortega found Rowan later that afternoon, not in town, but out on the trail back to May's homestead. The deputy looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. "I did some checking, Rowan," he said, keeping his voice low. He pulled a folded piece of flimsy paper from his coat pocket. "This came across the wire last night, just before the line went down in the storm. It's a copy of a message from Thompson at the Mercantile to the freight office in Helena, the one Pike has a controlling interest in. I have a friend there who owes me a favor." Rowan took the paper. It was a telegram transcript. It contained a list of charges to be added to the Hale account, a special winter haulage fee, a storm risk premium, and an expedited handling surcharge. The numbers were grotesquely inflated, a clear and blatant fabrication. At the bottom was a short, damning message. "Confirm application of adjusted rates retroactive to Sept 1. Pike authorizes." It was the proof, the tangible evidence of the fraud they had only suspected. The fine print in the contract was the weapon, but this telegram was the hand holding it. "This is enough to challenge the contract," Ortega said. "To show intent to defraud, but it will mean a fight, a public one. Pike won't go down easy." Rowan folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The thin paper felt as heavy and as powerful as a loaded gun. He rode back to the cabin not with the weariness of a man recovering from injury, but with the focused energy of a soldier preparing for battle. He brought with him supplies bought with the last of his own money, a slab of salt pork, a sack of cornmeal, more coffee. That night, for the first time since Daniel had died, the pine table in May's cabin was full. There was a skillet of crispy cornbread, thick slices of fried salt pork, and a bowl of the tart, preserved crab apples May had put up in the fall. The warm, savory smells filled the small space, a declaration of defiance against the emptiness they had endured. They ate together, the three of them, a small, fragile family unit forged in adversity. The lamplight shone on their faces, and for a little while, the threats of Pike and Frost and the town's wagging tongues faded away. The meal was a promise, a vision of the home they were fighting for, but underneath the warmth, The legal threat coiled, tightening its hold. The quiet was over. The fight was about to begin. Part 6. The Ledger and the Bond. The first winter market came to Ash Creek a week after the storm, a fragile celebration of survival. The heavy snow had been packed down into a walkable thoroughfare, and the town's single street was lined with makeshift stalls. Ranchers who had managed to get through sold cured meats and hides, and their wives offered jars of preserves and thick woolen socks. The air, crisp and cold, smelled of pine smoke from crackling bonfires, roasting meat, and the sweet, nostalgic scent of hot apple cider. It was a brief, communal truce against the impending winter, a day of determined cheerfulness. But for May, Rowan, Ada, and Doc Merriweather, the festive atmosphere was a thin veneer over a layer of coiled tension. They had a plan, hatched in the quiet back room of Ada's cafe, a plan as desperate and as dangerous as a lone rider crossing a frozen river. The telegram Rowan carried in his pocket was a single bullet, but the gun they needed to fire it was locked away in the mercantile's safe, the ledger book. "Frost will be there, and he'll be drinking," Ada had stated, her voice a low, practical whisper. "The market makes him feel like a king surveying his subjects. His pride makes him careless." "Carelessness is one thing," Doc Merriweather had added. "Polishing his spectacles. Getting the key to Pike's safe is another entirely. The man is a viper, drunk or sober." The plan was simple in its audacity, and terrifying in its reliance on chance. Doc Merriweather, respected and seen as harmless, would engage Frost in conversation. Ada would create a distraction, and May, quiet, unassuming May, would have to get the key. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of orange and purple, when they saw him. Gideon Frost was holding court in the half-finished saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his back to the roaring stove. He was laughing, a harsh, grating sound, surrounded by a few of Pike's sycophantic ranch hands. Doc Merriweather entered first, nodding to the patrons, a benevolent old physician making his rounds. He approached Frost with a concerned look. "Gideon, my boy, that's a nasty cough you've had this past week. I've a tincture that might soothe it, made with honey and horehound." Frost, flattered by the attention, waved the doctor closer, launching into a boastful account of his own impervious constitution. It was the opening they needed. Ada followed a minute later, carrying a tray with a steaming meat pie. "A gift for the hardest working men in the territory," she announced, her voice cheerful. As she set the tray down on the table near Frost, she stumbled, as if catching her foot on a loose floorboard. The tray tilted violently. The hot pie slid, not onto Frost, but onto the man next to him, who yelped as gravy and beef splashed across his coat. In the ensuing chaos, the man cursing, others laughing, Ada apologizing profusely, May slipped into the room. No one noticed her. All eyes were on the commotion. Frost, annoyed by the interruption, had set his whiskey down and turned to bellow at the clumsy ranch hand. His heavy winter coat was unbuttoned, and hanging from a leather loop on his belt, glinting in the firelight, was a heavy brass key on a steel ring. May's heart felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs. Her hands were sweating despite the cold. She moved past the group as if heading for the back door, her body brushing lightly against Frost's. Her fingers, nimble from years of mending and sewing, closed around the cool, smooth metal of the key. For one sickening second, she thought the faint clink of it against its ring was as loud as a gunshot, but no one turned. Her hand retreated into the pocket of her shawl. She didn't look back. She walked out of the saloon and into the twilight, the key a burning weight in her palm. Rowan was waiting with Juniper in the alley behind the mercantile. He said nothing, his face a grim mask, but his presence was a steadying force. While he stood watch, May unlocked the back door of the dark, silent store. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of spices and oiled wood. The safe, a hulking black iron box, stood in the back office like a malevolent idol. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. The heavy door swung open, and there it was, a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of figures and names. It felt heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of stolen land and broken lives. She tucked it under her shawl, closed the safe, locked it, and slipped back out into the alley, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She handed the key to Rowan. "Put it back," she whispered. His job was the most dangerous. He had to return the key to Frost's person before it was missed. As May hurried back towards the lights of the market, a new, terrifying thought struck her. She had the proof, but what if it wasn't enough? What if, by this act, she had only sealed their doom? The explosion came sooner than they could have imagined. Rowan had managed to slip the key back onto Frost's belt during another contrived distraction. But Frost, heading back to the mercantile at the end of the night, must have decided to check the day's receipts. The discovery that the ledger was gone sent a shockwave through the town. It was nearly midnight when they came for her. May had just gotten a sleeping Toby settled when the thunder of hooves echoed across the frozen ground. A torch flared outside her window, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. The cabin door shuddered under a heavy blow. May hail Gideon Frost's voice was a blade of ice. "By the authority of Ezekiel Pike, I'm here to reclaim stolen property." May stood frozen in the middle of the room, clutching the ledger to her chest. Rowan, who had been sitting by the fire, was on his feet in an instant, moving to stand between her and the door. The door burst open, and Frost strode in, flanked by two of Pike's largest men. Frost's face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes landing on the book in May's arms. "There it is," he snarled. "Thief!" He took a step forward. "Stay back," Rowan said, his voice a low growl. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, but his entire being was a shield. "This is between us and the woman. Calder, don't be a fool." "You're not touching her," Rowan stated. Frost's men started to spread out, their intent clear. They were going to tear the cabin apart. Toby, woken by the noise, let out a small, terrified cry from his cot. That sound shattered the standoff. May's defiant posture crumbled, replaced by the primal fear of a mother protecting her child. In that instant, Rowan saw the trap closing. He saw the terror on May's face, the threat to the boy. He saw the ledger, the one piece of evidence that could save them, about to be ripped from their hands. And he saw the only move he had left to play. It was a sacrifice, a desperate gamble for time. He took a step forward, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. His eyes found May's, and in them, he tried to convey a world of reassurance, a plea for her to be strong. "You're right, Frost," Rowan said, his voice ringing with a false and weary resignation. "It was me. I took the book." Frost stopped, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. May gasped, a choked sound of protest. "Rowan, no." Rowan didn't look at her. He kept his gaze locked on Frost. "She had nothing to do with it. I heard you bragging in the saloon. Figured Pike's books might be worth something. I took the key, and I took the ledger. She was just holding it for me." It was a plausible lie, playing to their perception of him as a penniless drifter. Frost considered it, his lips tightening into a thin line. It was cleaner this way. Blaming the outsider was always easier. "Cuff him," Frost ordered, as one of the men moved forward with a set of iron manacles. Rowan turned his head slightly toward May. "Hold onto that book," he murmured, so low only she could hear. "Don't let them have it. Fight!" Then the cold iron snapped around his wrists. They shoved him out the door and into the frigid night, leaving May standing in the wreckage of her doorway, the heavy ledger in her arms and tears freezing on her cheeks. The raid was over. The immediate threat had passed, but Rowan was gone, a prisoner, and she was alone with the terrible weight of his sacrifice and the terrifying burden of their only hope. A frantic, sleepless night gave way to a desperate morning. May left Toby with a bewildered but resolute Ada and went straight to Deputy Ortega's office. She laid the ledger on his desk, the story of Rowan's arrest tumbling from her lips. Ortega listened, his face growing grimmer with every word. He opened the ledger, his finger tracing the damning entries, the fraudulent fees, the impossibly high interest charges applied to half the homesteaders in the valley. "This is it, May," he said, his voice awed. "This is the whole scheme, written in his own hand." He looked up at her, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a spark of righteous fire. "But it's no good to us if Rowan hangs for stealing it. Pike will demand a swift trial. He'll say Rowan is a dangerous drifter and a thief. We have to move faster." The law in the territory was a slow-moving beast. The circuit judge, Elias Vance, was the only one who could issue a writ to halt the local proceedings and call a formal hearing. And Judge Vance was 2 days' ride away in Granite Peak, holding court. "We can't ride there in time," May said, her voice filled with despair. "No," Ortega said, a sudden, fierce hope dawning on his face. He gestured to the wall that separated his office from the telegraph station. "But a message can—" He grabbed his hat and pulled May toward the adjoining door. Inside, the air hummed with the strange, electric energy of the telegraph machine. The operator, a young man named Silas, looked up in surprise. "Silas," Ortega commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "I need you to send an urgent message to the marshal's office in Granite Peak. It's for Judge Elias Vance. I'm petitioning for an emergency writ of inquiry and a stay of proceedings in the matter of the arrest of Rowan Calder." As Ortega began dictating the formal, legal language of the request, citing evidence of grand larceny and fraud against Ezekiel Pike, Silas's fingers began to fly across the brass key. The machine answered with a frantic, rhythmic clatter, turning their desperation and their hope into electric pulses, shooting them across miles of frozen wilderness. May stood by the window, twisting her hands, watching the single wire that stretched from the office and disappeared toward the horizon. It was a thin, fragile thread, just like their plan, just like their chances. On that wire rode Rowan's freedom, her son's future, and the fate of her home. All she could do now was wait for the clattering machine to bring an answer back. Part 7. Before the Law and the Gun. The telegraph machine clattered its reply 24 hours later. A lifetime of agonizing waiting condensed into a few metallic taps. Judge Elias Vance's response was a minor miracle of technology and jurisprudence. A stay of proceedings was granted, and due to the impassable roads, he would convene an emergency hearing in Ash Creek itself. The venue, by necessity, would be the railway freight warehouse, the only building large enough to hold the interested parties and whatever crowd might gather. It was a place built to store goods, but for one day, it would have to store the town's hope for justice. The morning of the hearing, a fragile sun shone through a thin veil of high, milky clouds, casting a weak, silver light on the snow-covered town. The air was still and brutally cold. The warehouse was a cavernous, frigid space, smelling of cold iron, pine lumber, and dust. A large freight crate had been draped with a government blanket to serve as the judge's bench. Planks laid across barrels formed makeshift seating for the 30 or so townspeople who had braved the cold to witness the confrontation. They were a somber, huddled crowd, their faces pinched with cold and uncertainty, their loyalties a shifting, unspoken currency in the charged air. Ezekiel Pike sat at a small table to the right, looking unruffled and confident in a thick wool coat. A lawyer from Helena at his side. Gideon Frost stood behind him, his arms crossed, his eyes sweeping over the crowd with undisguised contempt. On the other side sat May, with Ada Quinn at her side for support. The ledger lay on the table before her, a silent, powerful accusation. Rowan was brought in last by Deputy Ortega, his wrists still manacled. He wasn't put in a cage, but was allowed to stand near the wall behind May, a prisoner in all but name, his presence a constant, painful reminder of what was at stake. Judge Vance was a tall, gaunt man with a fringe of white hair and eyes that seemed to have seen every form of human folly. He wasted no time. "This is an irregular hearing, born of irregular circumstances," he began, his voice echoing in the vast space. "We are here to determine the legitimacy of the seizure of one ledger book from the Ash Creek Mercantile, and to hear the counterpetition of Mrs. May Hale regarding alleged fraudulent business practices. Mr. Pike, your complaint." Pike's lawyer, a smooth, portly man, stood and laid out the simple, damning case. Rowan Calder, a known drifter with no ties to the community, had stolen a private business ledger, a clear case of theft. Then it was May's turn. Judge Vance looked at her. "Mrs. Hale, you have the floor." May stood, her legs trembling. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She saw the faces in the crowd, the Millers, whose land had been foreclosed on last spring. Old Mrs. Hemlock, who now lived with her son after losing her small homestead. She saw their fear, their resignation, and then she looked at Rowan, standing straight and steady against the wall, his faith in her absolute. That look gave her strength. She placed her hand on the ledger. "Your Honor," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "This book was taken. It's true. It was taken because it holds the only truth that matters in this valley. The truth of why so many of us are losing our land." Pike laughed, a short, derisive bark. "The woman is hysterical." "Am I?" May's voice gained strength. She opened the ledger to a marked page. "This is my account. It says here that 2 years ago, my husband and I took a loan for seed and tools at an interest of 10%, a hard rate, but a fair one. But this book shows other charges, a winter haulage fee added last month. When no goods were delivered, a storm risk premium added the day of the blizzard." She turned the page. "And here is the entry for the Miller family. The same thing. And the Hemlocks, a fee for expedited freight handling on goods that arrived on the same slow train as everyone else's." Her fingers stabbed at a line of spidery script at the bottom of a contract addendum. "And this clause, Your Honor, allowing Mr. Pike to apply new interest rates retroactively, going back to the start of the loan. How can a family ever hope to pay off a debt when the debt itself can grow backwards? It's not business. It's a trap." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The words on the page were a reflection of their own struggles, the vague, crushing weight of debts that never seemed to shrink. Pike stood, his face a mask of indignation. "This is slander, though these are standard business practices, accounting for the risks of operating on the frontier. This drifter has filled her head with fantasies to cover for his own crime." "Then explain this," Ortega said, stepping forward and handing a slip of paper to the judge. "A telegram, Your Honor, sent by the Mercantile to the freight office in Helena. It explicitly authorizes these adjusted rates to be applied retroactively. It proves intent." The judge read the telegram, his expression hardening. He looked up at Pike, his gaze as cold as the iron rails outside. "Mr. Pike, this requires an explanation." Pike was cornered. The carefully constructed facade of the benevolent town father was crumbling. His lawyer whispered frantically in his ear. But Pike's arrogance wouldn't let him back down. He was losing control, and it was making him reckless. It was Frost who broke. He saw the case turning, saw his power, which was merely a reflection of Pike's, evaporating. The law had failed him. He fell back on the only currency he truly understood. His hand moved, a blur of black wool, streaking toward the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "This is our court," he snarled, the words a low hiss. Time seemed to slow. Judge Vance, seeing the movement, instinctively recoiled on his crate bench. In that same instant, Rowan moved. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward, the chain between his manacled wrists stretching taut. He threw himself in front of the judge, his body a human shield, turning his back to Frost. It was an act of pure, selfless instinct, the protector, not the prisoner. A single, deafening gunshot exploded in the warehouse. The sound slammed against the high ceiling, followed by the high, terrified whinny of a horse outside Juniper, tied to a post, reacting to her master's peril. But Rowan didn't fall. He turned his head, his eyes wide, just as Frost cried out, a sharp, agonized sound. The colt clattered to the floorboards. Frost was clutching his right hand, a dark stain spreading rapidly through the fabric of his glove. Across the room, Deputy Ortega stood in a classic shooter's stance, smoke curling from the barrel of his service revolver. "Drop it, Frost," he said, his voice calm and deadly, though the command was no longer necessary. The spell of fear was broken. The room erupted in chaos. Pike, his face chalk white, saw his last gambit fail. His empire, built on paper and fear, had just been shot to pieces. He spun around, his eyes wild, and made a desperate dash for the large sliding door at the back of the warehouse. He didn't make it 3 steps. The crowd, which had been a passive, fearful audience, surged forward. It wasn't a lynch mob. It was something more powerful. It was a community finding its voice. Mr. Miller, a man broken by debt, stepped in front of Pike, his face grim. 2 other ranchers blocked his path to the side. They didn't touch him. They just stood there, a silent, immovable wall of wronged men. Then Ada Quinn's voice cut through the noise. She was standing on a barrel, her face flushed with passion. "Look at him," she cried, her voice ringing with a righteous fury that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "This is the man who decides if your children eat. This is the man who takes your land when a blizzard hits or your crop fails. He talks about risk. What about Mayhale's risk? The risk of an empty table. What about the Miller's empty table? How many of you have sat at an empty table because of the numbers in that book?" Her words struck a chord, turning their individual shame into collective anger. She was telling their story, the one they had been too afraid to tell themselves. Pike stood frozen, surrounded, his escape route cut off by the very people he had oppressed. The power had shifted. It no longer resided in his contracts or his hired gun. It was in the hands of the community, standing together in a cold warehouse. Judge Vance slammed his gavel, a heavy mallet he'd taken from a toolbox, down on the crate. Order in this court." The room gradually fell silent. The judge looked at Pike, trapped and exposed. He looked at Frost, clutching his bleeding hand under Ortega's watchful eye. He looked at Rowan, who was being helped to his feet by a trembling but resolute May. Based on the evidence presented in this ledger and the corroborating telegram, the judge declared, his voice booming with the full weight of the law, "This court finds that the contract between the Ash Creek Mercantile and the Hale Homestead is null and void due to fraudulent and predatory practices." A collective gasp, a sigh of relief, went through the crowd. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his gaze locking on Pike, "the Mercantile will be subject to a punitive fine and its books will be opened for a full audit. Mr. Pike, you are to be detained by Deputy Ortega and held for trial in the district court on charges of fraud and conspiracy." He gestured with the mallet toward Frost. "As for you, sir, you'll be charged with attempted assault on a judicial officer." As Ortega moved to put Pike in cuffs, a single, brilliant shaft of sunlight broke through the high, grimy windows of the warehouse, cutting through the gloom and illuminating the swirling dust motes like golden confetti. The long storm was over. The air in the warehouse, once heavy with fear, felt suddenly lighter, as if the whole town had just taken its first deep, cleansing breath. Part Sunlight, the full table, the warming wind. Winter held its grip on the Judith Basin for another 2 months, a long, deep freeze that seemed to lock the world in place. But the ice that had frozen the heart of the community had been broken. The change wasn't loud or sudden. It was a series of small, Quiet thaws. A few days after the hearing, Mr. Miller appeared at May's cabin, his face still etched with the harsh lines of a long struggle, and left a sack of potatoes on her porch without a word. Mrs. Hemlock brought a jar of her finest pickled beets, her handshake firm and her eyes clear for the first time in years. These were not acts of charity, but of solidarity. They were payments in a new currency. The currency of a community that had remembered it was a single body, not a collection of isolated homesteads. News trickled in on the telegraph wire. Ezekiel Pike had been transported to the district court in Helena, his assets frozen pending a full trial. Gideon Frost, his shooting hand bandaged and useless, had gone with him, his silence more damning than any confession. The Ash Creek Mercantile was placed under the temporary stewardship of a court-appointed manager, a timid man from back east who sold goods for cash at fair prices and seemed terrified of his own shadow. The reign of fear was over. With the spring melt came the formal news of Deputy Ortega's promotion. He was now Chief Deputy for the whole basin, a title that came with more responsibility but no more pay. He accepted it with his usual weary grace, though there was a new steel in his spine. The law had bent, but it had not broken, and he was now its staunchest guardian. Ada Quinn, her cafe now bustling from dawn till dusk, seized the opportunity created by the Mercantile's fall. She leased the small, abandoned shack next to the new railway station and, with the help of a few neighbors, turned it into a small pastry and coffee stall to serve the train crews and the few passengers who passed through. The clatter of the telegraph and the whistle of the locomotive no longer sounded like threats, but like the promise of a future. Throughout it all, Rowan stayed. He didn't speak of leaving, and May didn't ask. His presence was simply a fact, as solid and as essential as the log walls of the cabin. His dislocated shoulder healed, leaving a deep, abiding ache that troubled him on the coldest nights. But he never complained. He worked. With a quiet, relentless energy, he began to transform the homestead. He used the lumber Pike had intended for a new cattle pen to build a small, sturdy barn for Juniper and the mule. He spent a week digging a new irrigation ditch from the creek, its straight, dark line a scar of promise on the thawing earth. He was not just mending fences. He was weaving himself into the fabric of the land, into the life of the small family that had taken him in. He worked, and Toby watched. The boy was his constant shadow, his small hands trying to imitate Rowan's larger, more skillful ones. He learned the names of tools, the feel of different kinds of wood, the right way to coil a rope so it would never tangle. Rowan taught him with a gruff, patient economy of words, the same way he had taught him the bowline knot. One bright April afternoon, they were shoring up a corner of the new barn's foundation. Rowan was showing Toby how to brace a heavy beam. "A little higher on your end," Rowan instructed, his voice low. "That's it. Now hold it steady. Pa." The name slipped out, as natural and unthinking as a breath. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the chirping of a meadowlark. Toby's eyes went wide, as if surprised by his own voice. Rowan froze, the heavy beam suddenly feeling weightless in his hands. He looked at the boy, whose face was a mixture of uncertainty and hope. From the porch, May, who had been watching them, held her breath. Rowan's face, a landscape carved by sun and hardship, softened. A slow, genuine smile reached his eyes. He gave a single, assenting nod. "All right, son," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Hold it steady." The moment passed, but everything had changed. The unspoken question that had hovered between them for months had been answered by a child. Later that week, as the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the greening pasture, May found Rowan on the porch. He was staring out at the land, his hands resting on the railing he'd repaired. The world was quiet, peaceful. The wind, for the first time in what felt like a year, was warm. A gentle Chinook wind that carried the sweet, earthy smell of spring. May came and stood beside him, following his gaze. The new ditch was a dark ribbon running toward the creek. The barn stood strong and proud against the twilight sky. The land was theirs. They had fought for it, and they had won. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers traced the faint, silvery line of a scar on his wrist, a relic from his fall on the bridge, a mark of the price he had paid for their safety. "It's a good life here," she said softly, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His touch was warm and strong. "I was a drifter for a long time." "May," he said, his voice a low rumble, "running from a ghost that wasn't even mine to run from. I never thought I'd find a place to stop." He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious, holding a lifetime of unspoken longing. "I was thinking of adding another room onto the cabin. A bigger one, if you'd have me." It wasn't a flowery proposal. It was a statement of intent, as solid and as practical as the barn he had built. It was about building a life, not just dreaming of one. Tears welled in May's eyes, but they were tears of joy, washing away the last remnants of fear and sorrow. "I think," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that we'll need the extra space." He leaned down and kissed her. A gentle, lingering kiss filled with the quiet promise of shared sunrises and a future built with their own two hands. It was a kiss that sealed the bond forged in hardship and redeemed in courage. A week later, a notice was posted on the door of the old mercantile. It was an invitation, written in Deputy Ortega's neat hand, for a town meeting. The topic was the formation of a community food cooperative, a way for the homesteaders to pool their resources, to buy seed and supplies in bulk, to ensure that no single person would ever again have their fate decided by the numbers in a locked ledger. Pinned to the porch post was a coil of unused barbed wire left over from Pike's expansion, now being used to hold a loose gate shut. The wire was no longer a weapon of division, but a simple tool, meant to keep things safe inside, not to cut others out. That night, the lamp in the Hale cabin cast a warm, welcoming glow. The pine table, the one Daniel had built and Rowan had defended, was full. A platter of cornbread, golden and fragrant, sat next to slices of dried venison and a small bowl of wild berry jam that Toby had helped his mother make. The warm spring wind ghosted through the open window, making the checkered curtains dance. From the yard came the sound of Toby's unrestrained laughter as Rowan swung him up into the air. The west was still wild, its beauty still edged with a raw and untamed danger, but here, in this small cabin on the vast and empty prairie, a house had its light, a family had its home, and a table, once a symbol of all they had lost, was now a testament to everything they had found. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.